In a brutal massacre that took place almost a century ago, over 300,000 souls were lost. We have heard of wars and tales of wars. However, the story of the Nanjing massacre, also known as the rape of Nanking, is one that will leave you with chills. Today, as we walk through this memorial of the Nanjing massacre exhibition, let us recall and reminisce on this gory part of the Chinese history, never forgetting that war in all of its forms is evil and should be avoided like a plague. As Bertrand Russell says, war does not determine who is right, only who is left.
So this is the exhibition of the Nanjing massacre. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I have to put on my mask now. I'll be right back. So we're at the Nanjing massacre. I'm gonna take you around this memorial, and I'm gonna give you guys
These faces that you see right now, each one carefully represented in portrait, are the memorials left of the gallant people of Nanjing City, soldiers and civilians alike, who fought and fell to the more fiercely equipped Japanese troops during the Sino-Japanese War of 1937. An estimated 300,000 people were killed, raped, and murdered during this brutal time in the Chinese history. To represent the souls that died, they recreated stars on the ceiling of this memorial, 300,000 stars to represent the souls of the people that were lost. And on these steel tablets, each and every person's name is carefully engraved, never to be forgotten. In this war, in which the Chinese were greatly disadvantaged, both in numbers and in weapons of warfare, the Japanese troops thought it would probably take weeks, at most 6 weeks, to conquer the city of Nanjing, which was the then capital of China. However, the Chinese troops proved resilient and held up their fort, fighting back the Japanese for as long as they could. As a result of this, the Japanese troops, led by General Matsui, were sent to Nanjing to bring down the city a few days after Shanghai fell. After the Japanese troops surrounded Nanjing and there was no way of escape, General Matsui gave the Chinese troops 2 days to surrender their arms. And on the 3rd day, when the Chinese did not budge, the Japanese general ordered that the city of Nanjing be destroyed. At this time, the Japanese had experienced their industrial revolution and they had help from greater countries of the world, and so they were in possession of high-level explosive and weapons of warfare, and of course did not hesitate to employ these in acquiring the city of Nanjing. As a result of this force and brutality, Nanjing city was brought to ruins. Here's a recreation of what the city looks like after the invasion in December. And now displayed on the screen are some of the items of war used by the Japanese and the Chinese forces. There was a comparison of the Japanese guns and machinery, and quite frankly, that of the Chinese was a joke compared to it. Most of these weapons and equipments belonged to the Japanese army. These were grenades and explosives that they used to destroy the city of Nanjing. There's an interesting story behind this paper that you see on the screen right now. It was a brutal contest between these two warlords on who will be the first to kill 100 persons with the sword. This contest had to be elongated to 150 because, as at the time, the first warlord had killed 105 and the second had killed 106. There was no way to determine who killed 100 persons first, so they moved their goal to 150 persons. This shows an interesting part of this memorial, as it has the dead bodies, or rather skeletons, of the very victims of the Nanjing massacre littered around. It was because of these skeletons that this memorial was built around this area. And now we just go ahead to see these pictures that showed the brutality of the Japanese forces. This is a child who was killed, which meant that the Japanese troops at that time would not even spare the life of a child. They killed, raped, and looted. Even though most of the Chinese ran into refugee centers that were set up by foreigners in the land, they were still not spared. And here we hear of the tale of a young woman who was hiding in one of the refugee camps when suddenly Japanese troops entered and tried to rape her. She was heavily pregnant at this time. She fought them off as much as she could, and she would not let them have their way. As a result, they stabbed her multiple times, in her face, in her back, and all over her body. Fortunately, she was rushed to the hospital and she survived, but lost the baby. This woman would later on stand in the court in the International Criminal Court to testify against the Japanese after the war was over. The refugee camp was set up by these foreigners who lived in Nanjing at that time and did not flee the city in the time of distress. Headed by a German professor, they were able to save thousands of Chinese civilians in the refugee camp that they set up, and because there was a flag over the camp, it was kept safe from Japanese invasion. The professor would spend his days writing about the tales of the war and the horrors his eyes had seen. And now we encounter the brave and heartwarming story of Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, diarist, and educator who was the then president of Jilin College. She was a Christian missionary in China for 28 years. She was recognized as a goddess because she fought fiercely to protect the Chinese women and children who took refuge in her school. She protected them just like a hen would protect her chicks and made sure that they were safe from the Japanese troops. She would challenge the Japanese troops on countless occasions, putting even her life at risk. Unfortunately, after Minnie Vautrin returned to the States in 1940, she suffered from severe depression as a result of the stress of the war and committed suicide in 1941. In the 1990s, this beautiful and charming Chinese-American author, Iris Chang, after a lot of consultation and research, wrote a spectacular book that captured the happenings of the Nanjing massacre, and it was titled The Rape of Nanking. Unfortunately, as a result of this book, Iris Chang was threatened by so many warmongers. They threatened her family. They threatened to kill her child, her only son. They sent tons of letters to her home in the USA with lots of threats, and the stress and the pressure was too much. She committed suicide in 2004. Now, after all this time, it's been a long walk to peace, but now it can be said that the tensions between the Chinese and Japanese have reduced amicably. However, the Chinese still hope that there will come a day when the Japanese would apologize for their sins. However, until this day, they are still waiting.